Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the 7th episode of the second season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion and religious studies in America. The last episode was an incisive and engaging discussion on religion, race, sport, and capital, with a particular focus on the 75th anniversary of Jackie Robinson crossing or breaking or interrupting the color line. I want to thank Chris Lamb, Carmen Naco Fernandez, Randall Jelks, and Michael Long for that fascinating conversation. And if you didn't get a chance to catch it, please check it out on our YouTube channel or through a link on our website. This year has been an amazing one with record numbers of folks who are new to the center and new to this platform who are joining us to engage and enhance these conversations on religion and across a variety of topics. And we just thank folks for joining us, and we're excited that our next month will be our final conversation for the second season, and it will be religion and teaching for public engagement, with a focus on scholars and practitioners who are using their training to transform Hollywood productions, documentaries, blogosphere, and podcasts that reach beyond scholars and thinkers of religion and American studies. And a couple of weeks after our May episode, we will be gathering in Indianapolis for our biennial conference. This year, we have a jam-packed conference on topics from as broad and as wide as religious nationalism, to the role of the Supreme Court, to gaming and digital media and the scholarship and teaching of religion. And we want you all who are joining us to go and check out the registration form on our website, especially for our graduate students. For the first time this year, we will be having a graduate student session, and we're now inviting graduate students who are in or near the dissertating phase to give a mini presentation on the significance of their intervention and to receive feedback from a room of some of the most esteemed and rising scholars in the field. So please come and join us on the first week of June in Indianapolis. Today, we are turning to religion and spirituality in museums. In foundational museum studies, literature of the past 50 years, museums have been called temples, sacred groves, and places to connect with something higher or more sacred or out of the ordinary. In many ways, the museum has functioned as a third space, outside of the academy and outside of the sanctuary, to reimagine traditions, cultural artifacts, and as spaces of belonging and of community. How do museums today engage religion and spirituality? And with whom and why do people use those spaces to do that? And can encounters with objects and exhibits move people beyond the material world to consider the divine, the transcendent, reimagine the state or the politics, and even think about and expose the ideas around the concept of magic? We have assembled a panel today to explore these issues and many more. And I'm so excited that we have this powerhouse team with us that is going to help us think through the growing connections between religion, spirituality, and museums. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit questions through the Q&A feature on your Zoom. So if you have a question and our panelists really want to engage some of your questions, please drop them into the Q&A function. Do not use the chat room, but use the Q&A function to do this. This will enable our hosts and panelists to engage these questions and to facilitate this important conversation. Now, let me introduce the host for today's conversation. Lois H. Silverman is the professor of museum studies and the public scholar of museum education at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. Dr. Silverman's research has addressed visitor meaning making, museum and human needs, and museums as therapeutic agents. She has consistently thought about the work museums done, and she is a thinker and a theorist of museum practice. I would just encourage you, if you want to think about this alongside her, to check out her work, The Social Work of Museums. And then after you read that, to look at one of her upcoming chapters entitled On Museums, Transcendence, and Magic, which is coming out in the forthcoming book, Flourishing in Museums. But alongside that, Dr. Silverman is not only a theorist and a thinker of this, she's also a person that is engaged in museum practice. She is recently working with a group of students to help create visitor studies and to think about museum engagement with the historic Camp Chesterfield, which is one of the largest extant spiritualist communities in the United States today. Dr. Silverman's interests include everything from museums and health and well-being and the spiritual potential of museums. And that is exactly why when I was thinking about this topic and I reached out to Dr. Silverman, I said she would be the perfect person to help spearhead and facilitate this discussion. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lois H. Silverman, and she will introduce the rest of today's panel.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And I want to thank the IUPUI Center for Religion and American Culture for this opportunity to bring together what is truly a dream team of amazing scholar practitioners. I want to welcome everyone who's taking the time to be with us today at this very busy time of the semester. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists, so let's get started. Dr. Yvonne Chereau is professor in the Department of Religion at Swarthmore College, where she teaches courses on African American religions, Black women and religion, and New World African religions. She is the author of Black Magic, Religion and the African American Conjuring Tradition. And she's also co-edited Black Zion, African American Religions and Judaism. Dr. Chereau has published widely in the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion and the Journal of the Interdenominational Theological Center, to name but a few. And her website and blog called Professor Chereau's Academic Hoodoo at academichoodoo.com is enchanting. Her work focuses on the intersections between religion and magic and the diversity of Africana traditions in the United States. Please welcome Yvonne. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Mr. Ben Garcia is, as of January, the first executive director of the American LGBTQ+ Museum in New York. With more than 20 years of experience in museum leadership, development, and intersectional advocacy, Ben will lead this museum into its next stage of growth and the opening of its physical home at the New York Historical Society in 2024. Ben's previous posts include Deputy Executive Director and Chief Learning Officer at the Ohio History Connection and Deputy Director of the Museum of Us in San Diego. And at both of these institutions, Ben oversaw the repatriation of Indigenous ancestors and belongings. Ben writes and lectures widely about his work, and he is a leader in the field of museum education. Please welcome Ben. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Dr. Eric Lewis Williams is an ordained minister of the Church of God in Christ and currently serves as the curator of Religion, National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian. He has taught history, religion, and African American studies at many institutions across the country, including Western Theological Seminary, Ashland Theological Seminary, Iowa State University, Boston College, and Harvard University. Dr. Williams' research and publications examine the meaning of religion within Africana histories and cultures, the role and influences of African religions in the Atlantic world, and the relationship of religion and material culture, among other topics. Dr. Williams' studies have taken him around the world, and he describes himself as a transatlantic commuter, a collector of words, and an emergent jazzman in the world of ideas. Please welcome Eric. Thank you so much for being with us today. I would like to start us off with a somewhat personal question and understand what brings us together in conversation today. So my question is, why did each of you say yes to a conversation on religion and spirituality in museums? Such a huge topic. We only have an hour. What in particular intrigues you about this theme? Why did you say yes to join us? Eric, would you start for us?
Okay. Well, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you all today and be a part of this wonderful conversation. So as the curator of religion for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, it is this work that I deal with in the day to day. Of course, exhibitions, the research, the publications, the public speaking, the acquisitions, going into places and cultivating relationships with people who have these things that mean so much to them, mean so much to their families, to try to find a home where these stories can be told. And of course, even to see the impact of the artifacts on people when they visit the museum, people having religious experiences or experiences of transcendence, or these kind of experiences where they feel connected to something, a narrative that is larger, a history that is longer, and what that does for them. And so I just find this to be a place of tremendous meaning and meaning making, and I think that more and more people are beginning to see museums as that type of place.
Thank you. Yvonne, Ben?
Oh, okay. I'll go next. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. The Center for Religion and American Culture has a special place in my heart. I was one of the young scholars when I was young. And so I'm really, really delighted to be here. I am on a panel with museum professionals, museum educators, people who, I am the religion person on here. And what really intrigued me about this topic is the way that the museum in some ways parallels what we do in religious studies, in that it sits at kind of a nexus of ideas that efface what we think that constitutes religion and spirituality, and engaging these things as sites of meaning. So I think that along with the library, the museum is one of the most vital and trusted institutions that we have today. For me, as for all of us, probably the class trip to the museum when we were kids, that's the highlight of our journey. And opened my eyes to a kind of intellectual possibility and wonder, right? That comes close to a spiritual experience. And in some ways it's remained that way. As an avid museum goer and supporter, we have experienced these places as sacred sites, even pilgrimage sites, right? And this is certainly the case with our beloved National African American History Museum, which in our capital. These are almost shrines. These are sites where people go to experience what we might call religion, what we might call spirituality. So I just think this is an intriguing topic. And I will say, I think that there has always been a spiritual function for the museum, at least in relation to art. It's always been present. So this is sort of a perfect topic. The museum might be thought of as kind of a contemplative space, right? Where one connects to history and memory through art and artifacts. So it's sort of a natural fit.
Thank you, Yvonne. Ben?
Yeah, I think that, again, thank you so much for having me as well. And I would echo many of the same reasons that my fellow panelists named. I think a lot about museums as secular sites to consider some of the big questions that religious traditions encourage us to think about, how we want to show up in the world, what our values are, where our sort of moral and ethical lines are drawn. And I think that museums can be sites for individuals and families, whether they participate in a religious practice or whether they don't, to have conversations about these big questions. And so that's one of the ways that I'm really engaged. When you were speaking, Eric, one of the sort of key moments for me early in my career was when I read Lois's article in the Journal of Education and Museums. And Lois, you described something that at that point you called museum magic, and you called it those elusive moments of insight, transformation, and deep significance that help us to see the purpose and reasons for living. And I feel like I've experienced that in museums. It's why I've chosen to work in museums. And all of us are talking about those kinds of experiences as something we recognize happening regularly.
Mhm.
Thank you, Ben. I want to move to the question that everyone is probably expecting, and that is, how are we approaching these key terms that we're using? When Joseph made the introduction and in our description of this session, we cited some of the recent scholarship over the years that call museums temples and sacred groves and places to connect with something higher, et cetera, et cetera. And even the introduction to the American Alliance of Museums Code of Ethics for museums and practitioners states that museums use artifacts to, quote, nourish the human spirit. So there's a lot of language here that invokes religion and spirituality. And I feel like the opposite, in a way, the opposite to you, Yvonne, that I am quite the newbie to religious studies scholarship. I love interdisciplinary work, and I'm so excited to learn from you and from Eric and your expertise in religious studies. So let's just take a little time and explore these terms. So when we think about museums, what do we mean, or what do you mean by religion or spirituality? And do you have any thoughts about how these two terms relate? And are there any other terms that resonate for you? Like Ben, you mentioned magic. Eric, you said transcendence. Let's just open up for a little while this conversation about the terms. What feels good to you?
Yeah, I'll start since I'm the religion person. But in some ways, this is the perfect religious studies question. This is what we do all the time. We debate the meanings and the expressions of the thing, and in the end, the conclusion is that old joke. Like pornography. You know it when you see it. We may not. You can't describe it, but I think of religion as a kind of activity. It's defined as a human activity, right? It's a way that humans orient themselves to things that are ultimate or things that are sacred and so forth, transcendent thing. But sometimes what's lost in our thinking about this religion thing is that it's also something that we associate with world making, world creating, right? Which is in some ways what the museum does too. And so, I don't want to parse the distinction between religion and spirituality, although I would love to parse the distinction maybe later on between religion, magic, and maybe science, because all of those things are part of what the museum has become. But what's interesting is that I think people even in this session might assume that religious-oriented museums might be the places where one would go to have religion. But that's certainly not the case, right? Whatever we're calling these experiences. So I'd like to think, I always love to think more capaciously, more broadly about what religion can be. My dear friend Eric has invited me a couple of times to speak about religion at the extraordinary museum there. One of the first things I did, I talked about hats. Because of course, not only is sartorial adornment an important part of religion. And I talked about African-American religions and hats, mainly men's hats, but the collections themselves lent themselves to that kind of interpretation. All this to say, one doesn't always think of religion and hats, or religion and food, or religion and so many things. This is where the museum can come to play. So this is why I'm excited about a broad understanding of religion. It's pushing back against more sectarian notions that religion is just for temples, churches, and certain groups. All right, but religion is something, maybe spirituality. Maybe that's the term that captures it. So I don't know, others.
I think that's very powerful what you said, and of course you have been to our museum, and you've really enlightened us in that place. But I want to come back to this notion of the museum as a site of orientation, and that is what I'm amazed when I see families come, or two visitors come. What arrests them, what captures them, can be different things, and sometimes when in their experience with the exhibitions, they locate themselves in their lives and their times and their experiences in different ways, and they respond in very different ways. Especially at our museum, the Emmett Till exhibition. Even those who come to work, the security that works in that exhibition daily, there are those who talk about coming as ushers for Sunday service, and they see their duty as a sacred duty, and they often they're mourners who come and experience it. Children, adults that mourn. In fact, one person who I know, she who formerly worked for the museum, when she came to the museum the first time during her interview, they didn't tell her that they were walking her back to the Emmett Till exhibition. And here she is. She has a 14-year-old child, walks into the Emmett Till exhibition, and she breaks down. And they're like, "Oh, we're very sorry, we didn't tell you about this." But it was so, she connected in a very, very deep way. And I think that the museum provides for those kinds of experiences to some. And for others, it's a place of contemplation. It's a place of introspection. So people experience this magic in different kinds of ways.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that where that takes me is, also thinking about a museum like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and how that was seeded, how that was founded. And it's quite a different history than many museums that were started in the 1800s, in the early part of the 20th century, and where their origins were intertwined with structural oppression, white supremacy, homophobia, patriarchy, and the like. And so, I agree that when a museum has been set in the right way, or when a museum is doing the work of the difficult work of looking at its ingrained biases and structural, the ways in which it participated in structural oppression, those can truly be sites for transcendence and magic and the like to happen. I think that there was a moment in my career about half through where I realized for the first time that my experience of museums, which were very much in this area of highly positive, spiritual, engaged, magical, that it was the complete opposite experience for Indigenous communities whose ancestors' bodies had been taken without consent and brought to museums or were being held there, or whose belongings and sort of both material and intangible culture had been taken during times of great stress in those communities. And were being held hostage, essentially, and used in ways that went counter to all of their understanding of how we should be living in relationship to the world and to our ancestors. So, you know, I do think that in our museum, I'm working with a community like the African American community that has been both, that has found solace in concepts of spirituality and magic and religion, but has also been persecuted by religious institutions and has been victimized by religious institutions. So I think that's a really, you know, that's a big piece of it as we think about sort of the power of these spaces. There's such power in a number of ways.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for raising the challenges. I think that one of the things that brings us together is our enthusiasm and our belief that museums can in fact serve purposes of spiritual need, if you will, or meaning making, and all these different words we've used to define it. That said, we have to engage the difficult history of museums, and many would say that there is an inescapable present, that museums, despite our hard work, are still racist, classist, genderist, ableist, and elitist institutions. So I'm just curious if we go beyond our enthusiasm and engage some more of these difficult challenges, what thoughts that you might have for either examples where museums are making strides to change, or institutions that inspire you because they are directly engaging these difficult histories. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I had some thoughts about this. Again, I'm not the museum professional, and I did read a little bit before I came on to this this panel about some of these issues. In particular, the idea that the museum was created with a very specific function. But this is the thing that intrigued me about and about this topic. There's an article that I read that contrasts the museum as a temple versus the museum as a forum. And the idea there is that the temple is like the church. It reaffirms the faith. It's a space for intimate, reverent experience and reflection, and it's cultivated by the priesthood of the elites. And it's contrasted in this kind of model with the forum, which is a model after the Roman democracy, right? This is the participatory community educational center. This is the idea of a public interactive space. So this binary, which again I didn't really know that much about. I think that still exists, and I think that within that sense that the museum can serve both and or of these functions, that's what we're struggling with. So, or that's what we're thinking about. My idea is, and you know, again, I haven't thought too much about this, but the best spaces or the best museum experiences that I've been able to point to are the experiences that are highly participatory in terms of the community. And there's certainly, and I focus mainly on African American history and religion, there's certainly a history of that. We see that, of course, in DC with the founding of Anacostia Museum in the community from the very start. So the museum as the forum, you know, but retaining those aspects of the temple where need be. I think there's a way to have both of those things present, to balance those things out. But I really love to hear more about how the museums currently address these these legacies of, you know, colonialism in particular, in how they invite the communities to take part in determining what is exhibited, what goes on in the museum. So it's a fascinating question, and I'd love to hear more about it.
Thanks, Yvonne. Responses, Eric, Ben?
Yeah, well, what I wanted to say, I was thinking about the process of how we include music artifacts into our collections, and it's a very interesting process because the curators from all of the various disciplines, the curator who's trying to bring the artifact into the museum's collection has to present that before all of the curators. And what is so interesting is often when those presentations are made before the curatorial body, people will raise questions that people hadn't considered. And they will say, well, you know, I'm wondering if this is something we should acquire, because what would this mean for us to bring this? What would this mean for this group of people, or this tradition, or this community? And so it's almost a way, it's like a built-in kind of a way where we kind of critique everything that we bring into our collection.
Mm-hmm.
I also, as Dr. Shiro was speaking, I was thinking about the public programming function, because I tell people that and the museum where I work, and many museums, are not just sites of where people can experience exhibitions, but they're like cultural centers.
Yes.
They're educational centers. And so they often, when we have a public program, we'll often have time for talk back. So people can say, well, you know, it seems as though this particular segment of the community were left out.
Yeah.
And I found it problematic that such and such was said here, and no one said anything about it.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of space where people can register their concern with what has been presented to them, where curators can work together in a way that they raise red flags that sometimes fly below the radars of others. I think we kind of need that, so we won't perpetuate the violence, the historical violences that have happened in the name of historical preservation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. Ben, anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I feel like, you know, it's when we think about this, you know, the rise of sort of museums that are addressing a particular cultural experience, even if it's a very broad cultural experience, like, you know, African American or Black American or LGBTQAI plus, you know, I mean, that's, you know, or the new National Museum of the American Latino. I mean, these are huge multifaceted groups, but I do think that it's, you know, it's interesting that on this panel, you know, you have two people who are working in museums that are addressing a particular, have a particular lens on history from a particular set of lived experiences. And, you know, so I'm thinking about, you know, museums where that's not part of the mandate. And I guess I'm curious, you know, to hear what Eric and Yvonne, you think about, you know, when you're thinking about a museum that is maybe an art museum that, you know, is purportedly there to present all American art traditions or, you know, international traditions, like how is this different? Because I do think that there is something about going to a museum that speaks to a part of your identity and recognizing something that you don't get to see in most other spaces that does feel like coming home or does feel like transcendent, but then, I'm thinking about this in other museums and sort of wondering what colleagues in those places would be talking about.
And what I would say to you with regard to that is that when people go to some of these museums where there is no kind of mechanism to critique the way a community or a subsection of the community is represented, people see it and they talk about it. It's and they'll tell you because you realize when you get in those spaces that that though they say that they're representing you, that you're often rendered invisible, you're often rendered nameless, and people are very conscious of that. And I've gone to some museums, and I wondered what was the process for this exhibition, because there are red flags all over the place. And I'm sure some of you may have been seen exhibitions like that where you're like, whose exhibition is this?
Mhm.
Yeah, for me, it's an interesting question, and it made me wonder what are the kinds of museums that I like to go to. I go to all kinds. I don't just go to museums that feature the stuff that I study, and I think that again, and this is my plug for religious studies. I think that as a comparativist, it's a little. I'm not going to say easier, but when you go to a place where say I'm at a museum where there's no representation of African-American religion or whatever I do, it forces you to try to think in a way as to, wow, what does that artifact have to say to the artifacts that I know and love? What is the process by which I'm engaging religious? What would one find sacred about this that I wouldn't? We had a previous conversation, and I'll just say this quickly because it's about the museum in Kentucky, the Creation Museum, and it's one of the things that I really want to go see because it's one of these museums. It's an evangelical project, but it purports to be a natural history museum, not an art museum. And which is fascinating. Natural history, science, anthropology. These are the things that Africana and African-American cultures have really tussled with when it comes to artifacts and presents. So this museum is fantastic. It has dinosaurs. It's by that ark. It's this replica of the Noah's Ark. And one would say, well, that's not a museum. And yet it is a science museum that purports to bring a religious interpretation, a biblical interpretation to this world. So I think I'm going around the question, but that kind of thing really turns me on because I like to put myself in the shoes of the viewer and to try to see what is it that's sacred about this, and what is it that someone might find sacred about that. And I'll just say that I think that this is a slow process getting to this place. Not just curating the materials. One of my all-time favorite exhibits was the Sacred Arts of Haitian Vodou exhibit out of UCLA Fowler. This was in the mid-90s, which was to bring the religion of Haitian Vodou, the artifacts, a religion that has been marginalized, demonized, misrepresented, and again, fabulous catalog. And this is one of the favorite things for educators, right? The catalogs that come out of these things. But getting to that stage, getting everyone on board to make it come together. It might not have, there were several times when it nearly didn't happen. So these things are processed. I think we're in the 21st century. I think we're in a much, I'm going to say better place. I'm going to be optimistic and say that. But again, the collaboration, the community input, I think that can only make the experience better. I'm still not sure about the religion piece. I'm not, and something maybe in the conversation, what are we saying about religion or spirituality when we're talking about that? I think Lois, you said this somewhere, and it was so beautiful. You said that museums can facilitate human experience with their artifacts, spiritual, imaginal, therapeutic. That's the healing piece. I love that. And aesthetic. All right, that's religion, folks. That's what religion is. Maybe, you know, religion is an idea that's been colonized, but that's what religion is. So yeah, short answer, I think one can find these experiences in all of them. I think we get better at it as we go further along. So does that make sense? Okay.
That's great.
Yeah.
I want to pivot now with one eye on the clock and bring our audience into this wonderful conversation. I see a couple of questions in the chat. So give me a moment. I will look at these and share them with our panelists. So one question, I'm going to jump around here. One question I see harkens back to Eric, what you were talking about in terms of opportunities for talkback. At least I see a connection here. Karen asks, what are your recommendations for how museums can make spaces for visitors to react and or discuss in a safe forum these big questions and difficult questions that we want to delve into? Have you seen particular programs or displays that are most effective? And I will post that to anyone that wants to weigh in, but Eric, you were talking about that before.
Yeah, one of the things that we've done at our museum is we've created at these various points in the museum, these reflection booths where people can actually go and you can register your reaction to something. They're recorded and they are gone through by I don't know if it's education, museum education, or but they actually look at those. But also, I think that it's very common for people who find an exhibition problematic for whatever reason to write to the Office of Curatorial Affairs to kind of register complaints. We actually appreciate those complaints and those concerns and those questions. And so I think that and what they do is they'll pass it down to the curator who's over that content, and they will try to see how they can address it. But in my experience, and this is the very first museum I worked for, there is openness to questions and concerns and questions of clarification, and of course the different events at the museum. Before the world switched up during the pandemic, we had public programs all the time, but now we're kind of doing more things online. But the talkback feature was a kind of standard for the events that we would have, because we wanted to hear how the masses experience the content. And so thank you. That's my perspective on that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm musing on the question a little. I'm wondering about this. I have to read it again. This idea of a safe forum. So I went to the Vad Hashem. I went to the Museum of the Holocaust in Jerusalem, and there is nothing safe about that museum. There's nothing that one wants to experience as safe. And I wonder, and I'm thinking about the Emmett Till exhibit. I'm thinking about the Museum of Lynching in I think it's in Alabama, right? Or is it Mississippi?
The Legacy Museum.
Yeah, I don't know about this safe question, and I'm trying to think about how I having spaces. I don't like calling them safe spaces, but reflection spaces.
Yes.
But I do wonder, is that the responsibility of the museum?
Yes.
Okay, so, and I'm not dodging the question. I'm not challenging it. It made me think for a minute that there are museums or exhibits that are not meant to be safe in the way that I think the question is being posed. So I don't, and those generally become the controversial museums, right? And, you know, for whatever reason. So I don't know how to answer that. So I don't know. I'd like to hear, and I'd like to hear from Dan, because I'm wondering if you have some insights on this.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's in those museums that are presenting content that is going to draw really strong emotional and intellectual reactions, where creating space for those who want to opt in to process it, you know, can be really great. I mean, the examples I think of are when the Science Museum of Minnesota created the Race Are We So Different exhibition, they were very intentional about hiring staff to facilitate conversations with visitors as they were processing what they were encountering, which for, you know, many, especially white visitors, for the first time, they were encountering this concept that race is a social construct, not a biological reality, right? And, you know, I think about too in New York, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, they used to, I don't know if they still do, they would invite people after a tour to a kitchen table conversation, and they had, you know, you could get a cup of tea and some cookies, and you'd opt to stick around and talk about the relationship of what immigrants to this country went through in the early 20th century to current immigration policies and experiences today. And then a slightly different one at the Rubin Museum in New York, which focuses on Nepalese and Eastern, mostly religious imagery. Colleague of ours, Don Eshelman, created this Dream Over program where you go and you sleep in front of a work of art. And when you wake up, someone comes, I think with Jungian training, and to talk to you about your dreams and like what came up for you. And so like talk about creating space for you to sort of process something, you know, in this way. I feel like, you know, I guess it's hard to do it with lots of people. Mostly these are going to be opt-in small groups, but it's so valuable when a museum can provide them, especially as Yvonne was saying, when you're doing work that's not, it's not supposed to make you feel comfortable or good. I mean, if you did, there'd be something, you know, we'd be concerned, right? So.
There are a few more wonderful questions and comments in the chat, so I'm going to shift us to another one. Thank you for your answers. Braun says, I've studied diverse art and science museums, and both explicitly and implicitly express and promote spiritualities of belonging and connection to nature and kinship feelings within our own species and with non-human organisms. So these are ways curators express their ultimate concerns, their sense of the biosphere, and all that dwell therein as sacred. And the question is, have you folks noticed this too? Many museums seem like temples for contemporary nature spiritualities. Thanks for that comment. Any responses?
I'll just say I've noticed it. I encourage it. I want more of it. I actually I'm so interested in this line between religion and magic, or magical spirituality, where the world is animated. So yes. Even in that flower exhibit of Vodou that I talked about, these you know, the bottle is alive. It's not just a piece of art, and the bottle is made of natural organic materials, whether it's the leaf, which is sacred and powerful, or, and this is the controversy, the bone, the part of the human body, which is certainly part of our venerable iconographic tradition in Christianity and so forth. So I've noticed it. This is where the Natural History Museum and the Art Museum, the distinctions are kind of effaced, and this is where the anthropology comes in. I'm with you, Bron. I think that it's all bringing us to a sense of the livingness and the connectedness of all these animate things. Now that sounds kind of corny and cheesy in some ways, but when we're talking about this thing called magic, which I think is the next iteration of how we think about spirituality, it makes perfect sense. So short answer, yes, I've noticed it. I want more of it. It's not confined to one particular religious or faith group, or even maybe no religion at all, even nature itself, as you understand. So absolutely, I've noticed it. I think it's a good trend, and I want more.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Yeah.
Few more great questions in here, my goodness. Okay, Sally asks, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the impact of collecting practices over time that have valued some things and not others, reinforced and often spiritualized racist, racist imperialist agendas. How do we compensate for this loss of material histories moving forward? There's a second part to the question, but maybe we'll just go with this one for now. Any thoughts about that? Wondering about the impact of collecting practices over time that have valued some things and not others, reinforced racist imperialist agendas. How do we compensate for this loss of material histories moving forward?
I mean, I think that, step one is addressing the collections that came in, that were collected from communities that were under great societal stress and pressure because of either colonization or white supremacy. Looking at the pathway, when I worked in San Diego, the museum I worked at in San Diego created a policy, all of us together, called the Colonial Pathways Policy. And the standard in museums for collections is, was it legal to collect this item when it came to the museum? And that is a problematic standard because law allowed many things 50 years ago or 100 years ago that we would never do today. And so what we looked at instead was, at the time that this item left its community of origin, did it leave in a context of consent and sort of mutual empowerment? And the way you find that out is you have to consult with the descendant communities, the communities from which these items left. The museum in San Diego, the Museum of Us, made a commitment to only hold items that were there with documented consent in this time, which means that consultation had to happen for almost everything in there with communities all around the world, many of which are indigenous. So I think, one part of that is museums really need to work from an ethical or a values-based proposition. That proposition of the minimum standard is informed consent is a reasonable one, and not from sort of a legalistic proposition, because the law is always the minimum, the sort of minimum standard. And so I think that's a place where I really apply sort of the values of religion or spirituality, making decisions from a moral or an ethical standpoint and applying them even in moments where it's very difficult or where the proposition means you might potentially lose control of 80% of the things that you are currently holding. So that's step number one. Step number two, we think about a lot in the museum that I'm working at, which is the ways in which artifacts, papers, artifacts of queerness were destroyed, have been destroyed consistently upon a person's death, often by their loved ones, often by their families, either because they wanted to protect that person's legacy, they didn't want to expose something about themselves, or they were uncomfortable with that part of this person's life. And so, you know, there are big parts of our society, whether you're Indigenous, whether you're African American, whether you're a member of a number of different communities, whose artifacts and histories weren't considered valuable by dominant institutions. You know, to recreate and to find those artifacts and those pathways is very difficult. So a lot of it requires, a colleague of mine, Margaret Middleton, talks about this concept of queer possibility. You're not going to have the standard of documentation and I guess sort of Western academic rigor around artifacts that express queerness in the past. And you have to open the possibility. And once you open the possibility, you can start seeing things in a very different light. And I think that to me is connected to concepts of religion and magic as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben.
I was thinking, Ben, as you were speaking, when we talk about collections practices, is also this idea that we're not just collecting for today. And I was actually thinking about the Confederate monuments that there was a discussion in the museum after being approached about collecting one of the monuments that had been removed, that the people consented it would be removed, about bringing it into the museum's collections. And there were some really strong reactions against it. No way, no way, no way. But one voice of reason said, well, today you have all of these feelings that are so close to you, but 70 years from now, will it help to tell stories that this museum seeks to tell? And I think that we also need to keep that before us, that in our collecting practices, that we're not only collecting for today, but we're collecting for a future that we don't know. But these stories will help to tell stories about realities that happen in the world in which we live.
Eric, thank you. The part I hate the most about being a moderator is looking at the clock. As we were warned, an hour has flown by. I want to just sum up by thanking Eric and Yvonne and Ben for this truly magical hour. I want to thank the Center for Religion and American Culture, and I especially want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. On the screen, you will see a link to a quick survey. We ask for your feedback about today's program. A reminder that the next episode on May the 19th is Religion and Teaching for Public Engagement. We hope that you will join us. And a recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube page within a week. Thank you again so much. Please feel free to contact us for follow-up conversation and to get your questions answered. There were a few in the chat we did not get to. We appreciate all of your questions. Please stay well. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.